everybody. Welcome over. Wait a few minutes for everybody to arrive. I'm so happy that you're all here. It's gonna be a good panel. If you want, please share in the chat what has been the place where you have lived your most incredible experience, and how did the place impacted the experience.
Hey, check this out, Kibbo. I will step up a little bit further, move up a little bit higher. With each day I move to my ground. Step up a little bit further, move up a little bit higher. Settling what I found. Even though I might be able to find the answers to all that's untold. Stories in my mind keep me from sleeping well tonight. All you need is time. Only you know best what your soul is seeking. One day you will arrive, and you'll know there's a place you can call your home. Step up a little bit further, move up a little bit higher. With each day I move to my ground. Step up a little bit further, move up a little bit higher.
For folks just coming in, we're asking what has been your most incredible experience and where did it happen and how the place impacted that experience. If you want to share in the chat. All right. Well, I think we can start whenever you want. Arabella, welcome everybody to this session. I'm incredibly excited about this one. On this panel, there are some of not only the smartest people I know, but also some of the most incredible humans. And I'm really curious to see what will emerge out of this. And I'll just give the stage to Arabella that will be moderating the panel to introduce everybody.
Hi, everybody. Wonderful to meet you all. Thank you, Nico, so much for this opportunity. So the title of this panel is The Ontological Design of Built Space, How Villages Can Change the World. As I'm sure you're all aware, the intention of us being here today is to explore how we can build a better world. Today, we'll be focusing on the interrelationship between place, space, and design, architecture and experience, inner and outer landscapes, regenerative principles, and specifically ontological design. We are at a vital point, a critical point in the human story. On the one hand, we face cataclysmic disaster. On the other hand, we have the potential to create a regenerative utopian future. And I personally am witnessing an unprecedented evolutionary shift in the trajectory of human consciousness. I'm sure you are all too. So I really feel like the future is in our hands. I'm going to introduce myself briefly before introducing the members of the panel. My name's Arabella. I'm a multidisciplinary philosopher doing my PhD in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. My research is looking at the intersection of quantum mechanics, aesthetics, poetry, chaos theory, higher dimensional mathematics. My areas of specialism are beauty and time. I'm especially interested in how we can architect utopia on Earth ultimately, but perhaps initially simply localized utopias. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce the panel. We have with us today Seth Bunting. He is a coordinator and producer working at the intersections of live experience, locations, and technology. Roxy Shohadee, I hope that's the correct pronunciation. She is an executive director and co-founder of the Design Science Studio, as well as the CEO of Hab Ritual, an experiential production, interdisciplinary design and immersive art studio. Also, Brendan Graham Dempsey, a writer whose work focuses on the meaning crisis, and the nature of spirituality and metamodernity. He also runs the holistic retreat center Sky Meadow in Vermont. Finally, Christopher Breedlove, director of global activation for the Burning Man Project. He supports communities around the world through arts, events, and social impact projects, and engages in refugee work through Burners Without Borders. He is also involved with Burning Man Sustainability Group. So that's everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I thought we could open this discussion simply by delineating ontological design and what that term actually is. I'd like to invite Roxy to open with that question.
Hello, Arabella. Hello, everyone. So grateful to be here. This is an epic panel. So ontological design, designing for states of being. It's a design discipline that's concerned with states of being, existence, and designing the human experience. So ontological design does this by operating under this assumption that by designing objects, spaces, tools, and experiences, we're actually designing human beings themselves, society, etc. So we assume within ontological design that everything designed outside of ourselves has an influence inside. So in other words, as we design our tools, they in turn design us back. So by designing our environments, as we're discussing here, we're also designing how we think and how we feel. And by curating perception, we're designing reality. So this is sort of the operative engine of ontological design.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that articulation. Also, I thought it would be interesting to open with the notion of purpose.
Leaves no doubt. People.
Okay, we'll continue. Since this panel is on the purpose stage, I thought it would also be interesting to explore the meaning of purpose. The word purpose in Greek means telos. I'm going to open this to the floor of panelists. I'm wondering if any of you have meditated on the notion of a teleological universe, i.e. that this is a purpose-driven universe, and if so, how does that inform our creation of a regenerative future? Would anyone like to open with that? Brendan.
Wow, that's a big question. Great question.
I did warn you.
Yeah.
I did send an email warning you this would happen.
Yeah,
be fair.
great. So teleology is really interesting. And yeah, I've definitely meditated on that concept. I recently wrote a book called Emergentism, which is really kind of all about that idea. I think thinking in terms of how story and sort of mythos work to make the spaces we inhabit meaningful and our lives meaningful, and sort of the community activities that we participate in meaningful. That's sort of the lens that I approach that issue through, because if you think about the meaning of it all, it kind of lends itself to the sort of mythic register of thinking about life. And so one of the things I've been very fascinated by is seeing, developments in complexity science and a lot of things coming out of a kind of neo-holistic way of looking at the world and how things come together to create more complex parts that then have new emergent properties. And so emergence and emergentism being crucial to all that has been really revolutionary in the sciences, but it's sort of this new perspective that I think could be very incredibly meaningful for people, the proverbial person on the street, because it really shifts, I think, the way that you interact with others in the world, and how you live, if you are thinking about things as being part of a sort of broad teleological unfolding that's going in a particular direction. There's a directionality to how things are unfolding. I'd be curious to hear what other people on the panel think about that idea, but my studies have kind of emphasized the complexification story of being able to situate, contextualize human experience within a broader cosmic narrative of kind of cosmic evolution and cosmic complexification that sort of, generates these increasingly complex layers or levels or a kind of stacked ontology. And to be able to recognize that we're sort of part of that, we are participating in this 13.8 billion year-long trajectory. And I think to find meaning as being participants in that story. And so I'm very interested in the ways that mythos and storytelling can frame that really powerful idea for us, and then how that, I think, can kind of plug into intentional spaces, intentional communities, and the sort of ontological design that we're talking about here. So anyway, that's my little 5-cent response to that, but it's a really, really important topic.
Thank you. That was a really rich response. One thing I might just offer to elucidate further what you're saying is that when you speak about complexification, obviously this is cosmology, this is also systems theory. It's intimately interrelated with coherence. You can't have complexity without coherence. So as I understand, when you talk about a purpose and a directive where we're going towards, I understand it, that we're moving towards a state of ultimate supercoherence, and that is ultimate complexity, whereby every single part is in total unification with every other part. Therefore, we live in a state of total unity. That is what I understand to be the purpose, the reason and the meaning that we're moving towards. So I'd be interested to hear other people's responses on that, and how they may have considered the very nature, reason, and meaning of this universe and what this whole project is all about.
I'm happy to add.
Thank you.
Powerful, starting out with meaning. We're meaning-making machines. And I think it is the truest point in all of this. I remember overhearing Jordan Greenhall talking to Jenny Stefanati about 1.5 years ago in response to a question about meaning of life. And Jordan's response was, meaning, all meaning is found in relationship. And so there's this unique kind of pattern that we're in, and it's almost the paradox of even looking at ontology as a field, is that we're sitting in this, like, what is without is within, what we design designs us back, we build the tools, they build us, our thoughts shape our spaces return the favor. All of these are pointing to this idea that we are co-making sense of the world together. And so in relationship to, let's say, Christopher, my relationship to Christopher means that my understanding of myself, at least in relationship to him in this moment, is based on who I believe he believes me to be. It's kind of this weird God's head of all philosophy, and then we drive religions and storytelling and meaning making and sense making at this kind of inquiry, this core inquiry that we're in. And I think it's really important to point to how complex the idea of ontological design really is. And because of how complex it is, and because it addresses so many different points of life, I kind of frame it as really three intersections: how space and time and kind of people, or our psychosocial relationships, the places by which we dwell, and the kind of process and experience that kind of creates an interactivity between all of that, that's what's really designing our world around us. And so when we look at that, it's everything. And so to be in the spirit or the design discipline of ontological design both yields the greatest potential for behavior change, which is, I think, what we're most excited to explore, but also the greatest danger. It's where some of the most dangerous technologies in the world and our largest ontological repercussions happen. And so I think as we explore this and the complexities in it, it's also important to remember how simple it all can be as well, which is that we're just making sense of the world together. And so the better that we do that together, the more opportunity that we have to get to the end goal, which I agree is some kind of coherence.
Thank you so much. That was there was a lot embedded within that, and some things I'd like to come back to. Before I move on to Roxy and Christopher to hear if they have any reflections on the meaning of teleology or purpose, I'd love it if you could elaborate a bit more on that intersection of space and time and consciousness, because that's a huge component of my PhD and what I think about and discuss, and the unraveling of that, and how that creates meaning and beauty for what it is to be human. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and obviously how the physical space shapes the interiority of our own inner space.
So as much as things are not simple and life is not simple, it is nice to sorry, I'm getting a call in here. It's nice to get a sense of the world through things that we can kind of parse together as things we all understand. Space, time, and people, or space, time, and meaning, are really good categories by which we make sense of the world. Now, I think it's important to think about space as being this like place, albeit digital. We're in a space right now. We're in a where here, right? Even on the digital space. I'm in a where in a house. I'm in a where in a county, in a place adjacent to old traditions and new traditions, but where is consistently evolving. And there's parts that we know and there's parts that we don't know, and that's okay, right? Time, there's really, I still kind of like pointing back to the Kairos, Chronos methodology in time, which is just that we have a linear track moving out away from us that allows us to stabilize Kairos on top of it. Chronos moves out and away, and Kairos lands with the fidelity of a shared experience, and that requires place. So there's a coordination to it, right? I could say, like, I'm going to Burning Man, but if I don't know where that thing is happening, when it might happen, or who it might happen with, there's no shot in hell that we're all getting there at the same time. But when things are coordinated well, which I think is this interplay between space and time, and then an agreement between a body of people to that space and time, when we coordinate effectively and we know that we're going to hit Kairos together, that's where deep states of presence come online. That's where the possibility fields open up. That's where people are like, oh my God, there's so many synchronicities. It's not actually synchronicity. It's like engineered synchronicity. It's syntropy. It's a general aligning of parts to a greater whole. And that's really what's occurring at a place like Burning Man, which is subject to one of the largest social experiments in like hyperpresence, where space and time and meaning kind of correlate.
Thank you, beautiful. I'll use that as a segue for Christopher, because you mentioned Burning Man, and obviously that's what Christopher's involved in. And perhaps, Christopher, you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about the purpose of Burning Man, and especially your specific role within what you're doing there and orchestrating there.
Sure, thanks. I mean, the purpose of Burning Man is manyfold, and if there's 80,000 participants each year, I'd say we have 80,000 different reasons for its existence. But, you know, for me, I think there's something really interesting in the idea of a community that is temporary, because it allows us to design that ontological world renewed each year. And not only does it allow us to do it as a superstructure, but one of the best things about what we do is by not defining what people's experiences inside the container is, we then allow for thousands of mini experiments within that of other ontological designs. And we actually get to see what plays out when people design their communities, both in a social as well as a physical fabric in all of these different ways. I think for me, one of the big lessons that I've learned through Burning Man is that, right, whether we're conscious of it or not, every decision we make in the designing of our community is designing our reality. And I think for me, that's one of the most beautiful things about being able to wander around somewhere like Black Rock City, is to go and experience all of these different reality tunnels that exist through people's different designs. I think just to finish off my thought, I think that kind of thinking about that unconscious ontological design that we do, one of the things that I've really been rooting into and I'm very interested in is how are the ways in which we believe we are creating the new world? We're not just replaying old stories that we've inherited. And I think that as Burning Man, we've had to really deeply look at that. And while at one point we may have believed that we were going out into the middle of nowhere to build a new society, what we've actually found by rooting ourselves into that place is that actually there's a lot there in what we thought was the middle of nowhere. There's an entire ecosystem, there's communities, there's indigenous people. And in fact, for us to build the community that we've built, sometimes we've actually recreated unfair models where there are more of a working class and more of a pleasure class. And so what we've really been doing is looking back at how we design ourselves, not just in the event, but how do we show up in that space? And we're trying to tear down a lot of those bad assumptions we might have started with. And so to me, that's just what I feel very called to consider at this time is how are we actually stepping forward into new models instead of replicating smaller models that only support those that are inside of the container.
Thank you. And what are those innovations, those unprecedented social innovations that will allow us to transcend an old paradigm and potentially a kind of Orwellian Animal Farm-esque scenario whereby the revolutionaries end up being exactly what they were overthrowing in the first place? Do you have any thoughts? Like, have you learned from looking at Burning Man and looking, obviously I haven't even been to Burning Man, but obviously I understand what it is. I lived in Costa Rica. I live with many burners. All right. I feel very connected to it. And as I understand it, how it originated was, a very pure ethos. And obviously over time, things develop and things change. And within the human psyche is the potential for corruption and self-orientation and service to self. What we're talking about here is how do we create a radically new society in which consciousness evolves so that a self-organizing intelligence takes hold and we don't fuck shit up. So I'm wondering, you specifically, what you may have learned about that through your experience with Burning Man, one of the most famous social experiments on the planet.
Well, I think we're in the middle of that learning right now. And, kind of thinking back to something that Seth said about the multiple wheres of where we are, I think that through time, we are slowly living inside of the multiple wheres that we are. And so, right, we are in this desert, we are on Paiute territory, we are in America, we are in a capitalist society. And so we have to kind of go through and examine who we are and what we're designing in each one of those systems to actually be in that greater coherence and that right relation. And so I would really say that for us, it is a constant learning experience. And what we're trying to balance is how do we build a model of something that's new while we're still existing in the old paradigm at the same time. And the question is how do we move through those conflicting spaces where we may want to exist in a world where we're not bounded by capitalism, but at the end of the day, all of us are. And so that's really the edge that we're moving through, whether it's through the environmental crisis of, how does Burning Man exist in a world in which we are on the edge of a climate battle, where we know that the personal transformation quality that's happening inside that container very well may be what's needed to create the new paradigm, but also while replicating it, not being part of the same problem. And how do we also make sure that we don't get lost in the spiritual cul-de-sac, which I think is something that Jamie Wheel calls it, of thinking that we're moving forward, but really we're just spinning around in a circle, kind of chasing our tail. So that is a little esoteric, but I think those are some of the bigger questions that we're leaning on.
Thank you so much. That was.
Do you mind if I plus
please.
that?
Absolutely, please.
God, I love you so much, Breedlove. You're so special. He is really hammering home at one thing that I want to land here, which is that there is a compounding nature between the time spent interacting with the culture, the value that's created in the culture, and the economics that drive from that. And the unique variable that Burning Man still holds true and protects fiercely with its principles is that gifting mechanic, which drives the economy, which is antithetical to the rest of society. And so what that does is it allows for an aggregation of value that is distributed and much different than the average value chain that we're in. And so it separates us from what is normal, and it allows culture to function and form around it because it is so different. And so as long as Burning Man holds that gifting is its main principle, and they continue to use decommodification as its like policing structure around it, it will hold something more unique than any other social experiment I think has ever done in the last 100 to 200 years.
Thank you so much. I definitely think we can come back to Burning Man and Burners Without Borders and things like that, but thank you both of you. That was really rich. I'd like to offer Roxy a chance to speak also and to potentially speak about La Tierra, the project that you're working on with Nico, because as I understand it, that's maybe some Burning Man principles are lending itself to that project.
Yeah, thank you, Arabella. I think, to draw a bridge between La Tierra, Burning Man principles, and your original question, which was kind of looking at telos and teleology and, the purpose-driven universe and how it informs our creation of regenerative futures. So La Tierra is a regenerative eco-village and vision for how we can live in relationship with the earth and as nature. And right now the vision is sort of grounded in Costa Rica. But the kind of drawing the line between this conversation and purpose and how that lands kind of in La Tierra, the thing that was coming up for me just now, a few things. I think one thread that I'll pull on is around kind of nested holes and autopoiesis, right? This cosmology that's, I relate to cosmology very much in like, if you open a textbook and ask you what cosmology is, it says it's about the beginning of the universe, but it's the beginning of our universe and how each of us has a beginning of our universe. And autopoiesis is a beautiful regenerative design frame that's also rooted in living system. That's basically a self-perpetuating. And so if we're looking at being, our own different in our own different cosmologies and our nature of purpose within a self-perpetuating future that's constantly regenerating, and how do we make meaning? How do we kind of orient to story and myth to help continue that meaning? And how does that meaning shift through culture and relationship? La Tierra is very much kind of an experiment in all of those things. We have inside of the vision for the project very much embedded everything with ontological design and mythos. So how the different spaces are embedded with biomimicry and biophilic design and different buildings and structures that are completely biomimetic, and how the way that we relate in village and in relationship with the earth kind of helps us to draw more closely to our nature as nature and to each other. There's, a myriad of different ways that the structure of the land and the entire vision for the project helps to perpetuate more of that. One of the most fundamental pieces of that is that it's rooted very much in protopias. And so protopias are not utopias and they are not dystopias. That it's this sort of sweet spot that's looking at how do we make incremental progress consistently? How do we continually center and uplift previously marginalized, systemically oppressed voices and center them in a process of reconciliation? And so I think Christopher was also just talking about how do we not continue to perpetuate those patterns? And part of the protopian lens is also looking at at how do we kind of look at patterns of colonization, and inherently with the way that we're designing in our ontological design, also kind of de-pattern previously often not even consciously colonizing behaviors, ways of orienting, building up societal class structures, and inviting and not everything to be kind of baked into a constant process of extraction and continually having culture to perpetuate that extraction. And so La Tierra as a project and a regenerative eco-village is also looking at how do we create kind of microeconomies that reorient to what we think about as purpose and as prosperity. And we're future 7th generation thinking is a big part of that. And also, like, you know, how do we have microeconomies inside that are not only focused on breaking everything down into parts and resources and you know, making everything something that's tradable and everything is tokenizable, but rather in this sort of what Seth was saying, this relational field and building culture and shifting. Nico has recently been saying this meme, which I think is so good, and everyone should say it. Behavior is a function of culture. And so if behavior is a function of culture, and as we change culture, we change behavior. And if we create these places, these kind of protopias that are giving people an opportunity to experience another way of being and experiment in the ways that we relate, it provides an opportunities for us to evolve the way that we relate inside of culture, and the way we relate inside of culture changes the kind of makeup of our stories, our myths, and our future. So all of it sort of ties into a kind of complex interconnected system. Another kind of thing to close on is like regenerative design is often looking at like building capacity of the system and different nested holes. So each of these becomes a nested hole into itself, and our relationship and regeneration with ourselves and our culture and our community and our planet is sort of perpetuated in that process.
Thank you so much. There's also a lot there which we can come back to. I would just like to use what you mentioned about narrative and mythos, also for Brendan, as I know this is something that he really explores in depth. Brendan, can you explain the meaning of metamodernity and how that intersects with design, ontological design, and also the power of myth in shaping this new cultural psyche?
Yeah, that's a lot. Metamodernity is kind of the word people are using to talk about where we are culturally at this moment. If you think about sort of what had been a kind of dominant cultural worldview period of postmodernism or postmodernity, following upon modernism and modernity, going back to different sorts of worldviews, different sorts of meaning-making structures, really. Metamodernity or metamodernism is sort of what's people are talking about as coming after postmodernism, postmodernity, and kind of situating a lot of the developments sort of at the vanguard of culture in that particular sort of zeitgeist, sensibility, worldview, meaning-making system. Yeah, I mean, I guess because worldviews are meaning-making systems, they are part of the way we frame our experience. They're constitutive of and informing of our reality and how we react in the world and how we, make sense of the world. Then as these shift through time, we can kind of think about maybe the underlying structures of some of the worldviews and the sense-making, the meaning-making apparatus that goes on. And so metamodernism or metamodernity it seems to be characterized by a similar cluster of ideas informed by things like complexity science, systems thinking, that kind of holonic nested kind of ontology that Roxy's talking about, et cetera. Where there's sort of an appreciation for a multi-perspectival nature to reality, that people are inhabiting different ontological frames, you could say. So people are going to be living out their truth in different ways and being aware of that. And in some ways, you could say that having that be an important thing to factor into ontological design. So it's, I think, kind of inherently pluralistic, but it also avoids a certain kind of relativistic trap. Once you realize that people are living in different worldviews, different worlds, making sense of the world in sometimes very radically different ways, that can lead to a sort of vertigo of like, well, there's no up and how do I know what's what and whatnot. So I think one part of the metamodern project is trying to think about how do we make sense of reality and meaning in a way that isn't just sort of like this vertiginous sort of confusion or chaos. And so yeah, I mean, I would go back personally. There's a very compelling way of kind of framing our best sense at the moment in terms of how reality is unfolding by using things like systems thinking and complexity science and that sort of a thing to help bring some coherence, to use that word again, to this pluralism. So if you think about postmodernism or postmodernity, it's kind of characterized by this fragmented, chaotic pluralism. Everyone sort of has their own story, their own micro narrative. And I think metamodernity is more about trying to find the coherence that exists amongst this plurality. So it's talked about sort of an integrative or integrated pluralism or a coherent pluralism. I guess, yeah, the last thing I'd throw in there is that because it's trying to do that, the sense it will make of the world from a metamodern lens is going to be of a certain kind that is performing that function. So the myth or the meaning-making structure is going to reflect that. And so I think that the kind of increasing coherence that we're talking about, the increasing complexification, integration of worldviews and truths and whatnot, is a big part of, you know, a metamodern mythos and how I think people are framing, that kind of inherently human meaning-making capacity. I think Aldous Huxley, I was just reading a book today, and this quote came up that Aldous Huxley said that human beings weave. What did he say? They create religions the way spiders weave webs. But you could also kind of extend that to a broader sense of we engage in spiritual proclivities or spiritual projects or world building projects, you know, as sort of just something, I think in some ways that kind of comes very just naturally to us, that it's built into being a human being on the planet, trying to frame your experience and your reality in a way that integrates and makes something coherent there. So, you know, from a metamodern perspective, it's like, how do we do that in a way that is true to and you know, sort of pays, I think, the right recognition to this plurality of worldviews, but then also finds a way to sort of integrate that.
How do we do it? What I'm interested in, I agree with everything you're saying, and I suppose I'm a very theoretical, speculative person. I'm spending most of my life, you know, up in the abstract intellectual realms. Our task, though, is this unity, this coherence, the coherence of the pluralism. How do we actualize it? How do we practically actualize it? Because ontological design, it's not just an idea, it's physical spaces. This is about how villages can change the world. So how do we, in this totally fragmented, disrupted, patriarchal, corrupted society, instigate that, right? Like, how do we take a unified mythology and incorporate that to people's pluralistic, multivalent perspectives on reality in a way that is coherent, that is shared and is universal? Like, practically, how do we do it? That's really the main question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, I mean, in a nutshell, I think one of the things that's really important is to frame. I don't know if that question was for me directly. We can just, you know.
It's open. It was to you, but it's also open. So if anyone, you guys can raise your hands, like just for everyone to meditate on that, for sure.
Yeah. Just briefly for my part, I would say that I think having a sense of where different folks are coming from, what they're bringing to the table, what their worldview is, I think there's a lot of value that we can get from trying to get a sense of sort of the map, if you will, of worldviews, of meaning-making structures, right? So that's something that's very important for me, is sort of like being able to get a sense of that, which there's always some danger there. You don't want to overgeneralize things. You don't want to lose too much of the specificity and the detail by trying to make these sorts of categories or taxonomies that can lose some meaningful differences. But at the same time, I think if you want to implement that sort of ontological design program that's kind of integrative, but also pluralistic, you have to kind of consider the different demographics and different worldview systems that exist, and then think about trying to make something where these are interacting in a way that leads to a harmonious result rather than sort of the cacophony of sort of the culture war, right? So I think the step at least begins with trying to kind of map worldviews and then be able to think, all right, how would we ontologically design lived spaces and storytelling spaces in light of these maps? So I think that's one thing I would say that's an important first step.
Thank you so much. Would Seth, Roxy, or Christopher have anything to say?
Can you repeat
Yeah,
the question?
very simply. And I think also, like someone just mentioned, this is a very dense conversation. I think it's important to realize that we're dealing with very, very embedded meanings for people who may not be coming from areas of academic expertise or these areas. So like, I want to break down really simply, how do we physically, literally actualize what we're talking about, an idea, like a mythological unity, a coherent narrative for humanity, a worldview? How do we translate that theoretical paradigm into lived experience, into actual spaces? Like, how do we do that? Do we just do our own village? Do we create a village with the same idea and do it all over the world? Like, I want some practical answers, would be great if anyone has them. I don't, so.
I want to go back to a little bit about what Brendan was just saying. Making sense of the different systems, the different cultures, the different ways of thinking. It is an avenue, but the complexity in that and the nuances involved, and generally the English language that it's based in, requiring people to find more information to become more coherent, I think could be a danger. And the reason being the nuance between. So there's all that, and this is where I think AI becomes maybe our greatest strength and our greatest curse simultaneously, is that there is latent space between every idea, every piece of meaning, and especially when we are using language to language kind of interactions. What happens is that we just start to deal with different ways of seeing things. There's a great quote that I can share from, I believe it was Heather Heining was responding, she's an evolutionary biologist, responding to Jordan Peterson when her and Brett were on a podcast with them. He said something along the lines of, if you lived any sort of normal existence a couple hundred years before the present, you would find out that you grew up around the people that you ended up interacting with as an adult. You didn't stray very far from home, and the language you used would have been incredibly familiar because it would have been picked up from an immediate group of ancestors that you both knew. But now we use this tool of English, let's say, but language in general, but let's say English. And it's an incredibly blunt tool because the ancestors by which we picked up that shared language are quite distant. So in modern times, you have a couple different types of people in the world, those who use the tool of English as it was handed to them, right? And they press out more information, and Wiki gets bigger, but it gets bigger in a very specific language, right? So our commons, that is our most robust commons, that has the most potential to drive coherence, a database, a repository, is in English. And it, yes, gets translated, but the challenge is that it's based in English. And so the words move in English. And what happens is you get two types of people: those who use the tool as it was handed to them and they don't question it. And then you have those that are trying to break new ground, which is why you get a comment like, "This is the densest conversation I've ever heard." It's because we're doing our best as workers and creators to use language. Like, you're laughing, Arabella. You learned English maybe as your first language, maybe as your second language. You retooled it for the entirety of your life to fit the experiences of your life. Well, Seth learned English too. And Seth retooled English to fit the entirety of my life. And then we'll put two such people in a room. And this is what they said: you'll put two such people in a room who are generative, who have done their own work, who have arrived at some interesting conclusions, and they'll talk right past each other because they both forget that they both redefined all the words over the course of their life. And so what is essential is for us to start slow. Jamie Wheel says, forge intimate, deeply caring relationships with those who will belay us to a peak, like people that belay to a peak. We need to know that our travel partners have our back, right? And that happens, and the only solve for it, and this was the hammer that Heather pointed to. She was like, there's only one solve for that, and it's time. It takes time to learn each other's language. And so when we start to require people to have too much information to even be in a conversation with us, like most people can't sit in this room. Understand that some people might leave even today because they don't understand what's being talked about. And that's unfortunate because we're actually talking about things that, from our sense of language and because we found each other in this room, they kind of make sense as we're talking about it. But that doesn't mean that it makes sense for a lot of people. And so requiring people to get there, I think, is dangerous. And so potential avenues: one, build beautiful spaces for deep presence. Just build space where language becomes secondary to nonverbal communication. And two, we have AI-backed AR, which is an opportunity that we've never had to create symbolic language, new Morse code for humanity. And that is an avenue that we need to be staring at. What does it look like to interface with a new keyboard, essentially, a new way in which the internet works, where language is different, and where we can interplay across a coherent, less language way of doing things, because how we do things is what brings about culture. So that's where I would say is AI-backed AR coordination tooling, which we can have a long conversation about because it's directly what I'm staring at. But the secondary is just like, do what we're doing. I'm in the middle of a house right now, setting up a onesie pajama party that Nico and Roxy are coming to after they get off this call. And we're going to create this like wild theatrical world for people to participate in, not because we believe fiction is the answer, but because when people are thrown into suspended disbelief, posed that what if this might be the world for the night, they tend to be a lot more present, and then they tend to be a lot more connected because they're present. And so we make fun parties while we figure out how we're going to change the world. Language is key, and I don't know that requiring people to learn too much to become more coherent is really the answer, unfortunately. As much as
Thank you.
I wish we could wave a wand.
Thank you. Sorry. Go
Oh.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
It's okay, Arabella. Do you want to draw a bridge?
Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much, and to condense what I'm hearing from that, and that was really brilliantly answered, is that it's about shared understanding, shared experience, and shared meaning in a way that transcends individual languages, no matter how virtuosic one may be in one particular language. And we do that through being together and through the ineffability of physical space and different artistic media, right? And then, of course, I would love to, Roxy, I want to hear you, and then I'd love to come to Christopher and also talk about AI, maths, digital art, these sorts of immersive experiences. Again, like truth, beauty, beauty, truth, that is all you know on earth and all you need to know. This is what I study as beauty. Beauty is a shared experience. No one can argue to beauty. No human who goes out and looks at the starry night sky, unless they are seriously desensitized, can argue that they are seeing something magnificent and mysterious and exquisitely, ineffably profound. And that, for me, is where the magic happens. And that's why I think things like Glastonbury, Burning Man are so potent, because people come together and it takes their breath away, because they're in the presence of beauty, and beauty is transmitted through art. For instance, mathematics is incredibly beautiful if you speak the language. Euler's identity is incredibly beautiful if you understand imaginary numbers. If you don't, you can't perceive it. I understand this whole universe to be a poem unfolding. How do we create different kinds of poetry? Roxy, please share away.
I'm so glad you spoke first. That was a beautiful segue, and I just love listening to you talk in general. So thank you for what you shared. And it actually sets me up in a lot of ways to reflect on this question around how do we actualize what we're talking about, this sort of mythological unity and worldview, and translate that into actual spaces and experiences that people can have. I'll start from where you actually reflected, and I'll go back to where Seth was, which is I definitely think that we do actualize this through shared experience. The thing that led me to deciding to focus on art and experience as a tool to catalyze social and systemic change is an experience I had at Bonnaroo, also a very large music festival. I was standing in a concert of 100,000 people at Radiohead, and I just looked around and I'm like, I can see almost every age and race and socioeconomic background around me, and everyone is silent, and I could hear a pin drop. And what's happening is that they're having a shared experience. And one of the things that that does is it provides sort of what Seth would definitely call a diactic shift, these different places and spaces that allow us to move through and pause Chronos and move into Kairos and say, so for those of you who don't relate to those two terms, kind of Chronos is our linear time and Kairos is sort of like a timeless time. A time beyond time. And so it is these places and spaces that can help hold. But then, kind of going back to something that Christopher brought up a while ago, which is about, are we perpetuating the same patterns? The world is maybe not, and those experiences are not totally inclusive for all types of people. And so if we're really trying to make a world that works for all, we also have to think about, different types of people whose voices are maybe not being heard, and different types of voices who are not human. And so Seth touched a little bit on AI, and one of the outside, a lot of different disciplines have been brought up and frameworks. And another framework that I hold very dear is cognicism. It's a framework that my partner works on, and it's very much rooted in how do we collectively make sense of the world through a reflexive society, and largely supported by large language models. So this is definitely looking at how these tools, and actually this came up as well earlier in a panel that Mike from Future Thinkers was on, which I was really excited about seeing another place that it's being implemented. But one of the things that is the potential of some of these large language models or AI, a lot of you maybe have been orienting or interacting with ChatGPT, is, and right now we're orienting with it in English, but you can, there's ways that they can kind of take in other languages, other types of information, other, it's language based, but over time that can evolve to be more equitable. But using the frame of language that Seth was talking about, whenever we get to a point where we're trying to make sense of a pluralistic world, of a pluralist world, it's not black or white, there's so much in between, there's so much complexity. The answer maybe is not to try to just diminish and distill, because our limitations as humans are that we can only take in so much information. But some of these tools can actually help us to process information and then go into, if they're structured correctly and engineered correctly, so this comes back to ontological design, what are the reflexive properties that are baked into it through shared meaning making and culture and community that can actually help us to orient to this large amounts of information and language, and making sense of the world. So that's kind of, I think, a big piece of the puzzle, and I can share some links in the chat afterwards. And then the last thing that you were speaking about are kind of beauty and artistic media and being together and the ineffability of space and art. And, I think art has and will continue to change history. And that's, I think, also part of why a core of La Tierra is Land of O, which is this entire immersive world of experiences that's very much rooted in how throughout the sands of time, humans have had a relationship with space and story. And so from everything from sacred fires to festivals, temples to immersive art, Burning Man, the Kogi caves and the cathedrals, all of these are helping us to bring this worldview. These cultural spaces become sort of portals across history, and they gift humanity with experiences that foster community and insight and connection. And so that's why at the heart of part of what we're doing is continuing to perpetuate spaces, that culture perspective from the personal to the communal to the global. And I think if we just continue to actualize a culture of curiosity and a culture of sort of these nested holes that Brendan was talking about, and I was was talking about earlier, then I think from the personal to the communal to the planetary, this sort of as nature with nature, circular, complete, and timeless, we have more of an opportunity to utilize these spaces of suspended disbelief to invigorate our imagination and remember our place within the bigger story.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I'd love to open up to Christopher in line with that and experiences. I think you write on your website about that you're interested in how science and mathematics can manifest magic in a digital age. So I'd love to hear more about that and how this corresponds to what's been spoken about specifically around experience and the power of experience and art.
Yeah, you know, what's coming up for me right now, and it's interesting because I think that as I gain experience and age, I start to change exactly how I think about certain things. And I think one of the things I've really been settling into is whether the promise or the dream of high tech can actually save us. And that there has to be a examination of both high tech, but also low tech, I think, for the future that we actually want to be in. And what I tend to find people are actually gravitating towards at the moment are actually places where people can unplug. I think that's actually one of the reasons people love Burning Man, is because you're actually out of the digital sphere for most of your time there. And people find that the experiences they're gaining in that container feel more real, feel more meaningful, feel more connected. It actually allows you to create an ethos with a small community in your own way. And, you know, even small technological changes that we're seeing in Black Rock City right now create a massive change. And I think one of the big changes we've started to see, even though it seems small, is the idea of electric bicycles. All of a sudden, over the last couple of years, electric bicycles have become rampant at the event. And there's actually a huge pushback against it right now. And the question is the goal for me as an individual to get there faster? Or is it actually to slow down and find what the experience is available when I move at the same speed as everyone else around me? And it's these really small changes in the ways even we are mobile that creates class differences between people. People who have access to move fast versus those who don't have access. All of a sudden, you're creating divisions within communities and groups. I'm not saying that like electric bikes are bad by any means, but it's interesting how as soon as you introduce one element that creates a difference in speed between individuals, how that starts to stratify how different people's experiences are. And so I think to me, that's one of the things that I'm really kind of sitting back and grappling with, is that, you know, in the push for the electrification so that we get off of fossil fuels, is the point that we're all in cars moving autonomously and siloed together? Or is it that we're moving towards something like better public transportation that actually brings us back together into a community? I think that's the trick sometimes, is that when we're looking at these technological solutions, one of the things that we're trying to create is, how do I live my life that I have right now better, faster, more sustainable? When I think our call in the world right now might actually be to question if moving at this pace is inherently sustainable and regenerative at all. And can a population at this level achieve speed at that level? And I'll just add in one last thought. You know, another thing that I sit with a lot is right now we have around 89 million people that are stateless on this planet. That's an astounding number. That's in the top 20 countries on the world. And so if we're looking at a world that's going to get faster and faster, and then we're trying to plug that many people in, I don't know if the institutions we have can sustain that much movement and that much speed. So to me, there's this question, and I think that's where art comes into play, is that art asks us to slow down. Wonder asks us to slow down. Community asks us to slow down. And I think that the idea of bringing all of these multi-pluralistic views together means we have to slow down and we have to listen. And we have to root into what are our principles and are our principles leading us? And I think that's just kind of the thoughts that I'm really holding around all of this. I don't want to be against a technological solution, but I am just sometimes concerned that if we don't look at the slower portion of life alongside of these high-tech solutions, we may be racing towards a future that can't sustain itself, just looking at the amount of energy, let's say, that Web3 or that even AI takes. Can we slow down? And do we have the resources for everyone on the planet to achieve that quality of life? And if we can't, what quality of life do we need to achieve so that all people on the planet could actually be there together?
Thank you so much. That was really, really brilliant and such an important inquiry. For me, what I'm hearing and what I experience is this bifurcation. On the one hand, there is this deep yearning to slow down and, exactly as you say, unplug and to remove ourselves and to experience temporality differently, you know, through art or through whatever. And at the same time, everything's speeding up and we're approaching ecological cataclysm, and yet there's this revolution in consciousness. If you wouldn't mind just talking for a moment about Burners Without Borders, because I know that's really important to you and what you've learned from going to kind of critical refugee situations around the world.
Yeah, I could do that quickly. And I would say, right, so Burners Without Borders, we have a deep history in disaster relief. And that also moves into the world of refugee crisis. And I think that one of the things that we've discovered in these places is that when a community is shocked to the point where the institutions fall down, oftentimes people, when they look back on that time when mutual aid was the reigning principle of how to survive, have often said that it's been some of the best times of their lives. And we could see that correlation, I think, in an experience like Burning Man or a festival or these things, where when we're all in the same hardship together, all of a sudden, some of these things that divide us, or even the diversity of how we might view the world, doesn't matter so much, in line with how am I making it through tomorrow? How is my community making it through next week? And so I think that, you know, we've found a very interesting correlation and experiential design opportunities between things like festivals and disaster zones and refugee camps. And so one of the things we can do is when communities are forced to restart, which is what happens there. Whereas when you're village building, I think you're choosing to restart, right? Different ways to get to the same place. Again, I think by choosing what principles we put forward, really is the ontological design, you know, challenge in front of us. And I think, like, as an example, you know, one of the things that we've done at Burning Man is that we consciously choose, if you know the design of our city, to keep the circle non-closed. And the reason we don't close the circle of the city is that we find when people have an orientation point to be able to know where they are, not only do they move around better, but we're also orienting our community towards nature as a participant in that experience. What we're noticing is that as refugee camps are becoming non-temporary situations, they're kind of semi-temporary. Again, Nakia Vale was started in 1958. It's still around, over 100,000 people. When people are all crammed into these kind of grid-like systems, which feels efficient, what it does is it decreases the amount of social space that you actually have. It doesn't include people into nature. And so we're starting to see that certain places, like a place called Uhuru Land, which some of you might know, Mike Zuckerman, he's been a huge part of that. He's been designing spaces inside of refugee camps that use these ontological designs, which include nature as a focal point, which includes orientation devices so that people can move through. And I think that, again, whether you're in a disaster zone, a festival, or a village, these are kind of those questions of how do we place ourselves in a place so that we know how to orient. As soon as we land, we can find the things that we're moving through, and we're actually creating social space that breaks down that kind of individualistic nature we find in cities like this. That was a little wandering, but I think you got my point there.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I would just like to invite Brendan, if he would like to contribute to anything that's been shared thus far, to reflect on it. I'm still also desiring to unpick the intersection between the cathedral as a symbol and a metaphorical, well, just a metaphor, and a physical space, and ontological design as physicality, and how you would transfer that, and if it corresponds to anything that's been said, like, because this conversation could go in so many ways. Also, if you guys want to talk with each other, please just like go for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things coming up for me, I think, from the conversation is there's a dynamic tension that can be very generative, could also be very let's say destructive, between differences and sameness. You could think about it, right? And so there's a challenge between finding the right balance of making spaces that accommodate for difference, and making spaces that are totally shared, totally common, totally open. And that's coming up for me because I think that good ontological design will find ways to do both. I mean, you brought up a cathedral, but you could use any example from various traditional spiritual lineages and the kinds of temples and structures and gathering spaces that emerge in those contexts, where there is a shared space, and there's a sense of everyone here is sort of equal. They're all on the same footing in some very meaningful, profound way. But then also everyone is able to participate something unique from where they're coming from uniquely. And I think that, really successful community design spaces are ones in which both of those things can kind of be dynamically reinforcing one another. And so I would throw that into the mix, and to tie that back to that question around worldview mapping and that sort of a thing. I do think that it's important that we don't lose the differences of worldviews by trying to emphasize the shared space mentality of like, we need to all be doing the same thing and all be on common footing. And so we can lean into creating spaces that are sort of specifically designed for specific demographics and specific meaning-making structures, you could say. And I think that would be really valuable. And then at the same time, we can have amidst that this sort of communal hub at the core of it, so that people are able to both fully express themselves where they are coming from in their own unique way, but then at the same time also be part of this broader collective whole. And for me, that's very much about what complexity is. It's about integration and differentiation, right? So you get more difference, more diversity, but then that diversity able to also come together and do something coherent together. And so, yeah, I think that when religious traditions, let's say, or mythological systems have been very successful in the past, it's because they've been able to get that balance right. I think today in, postmodern society, we get a really heavy dose of the differentiation and the difference and the diversity, and everything's sort of broken up, and we are siloed, and we're all sort of, separate from one another. And so there's a reaction against that of wanting to kind of come together in meaningful ways. But again, that sort of dynamic kind of dialectical tension is what creates, I think, the right balance. It's an equilibrium kind of space that's found. So I just wanted to bring that up. And yeah, in the context of sort of building the cathedral and extending that metaphor a bit, I think a great way in which something like that can happen is when there's a shared project. I use the metaphor of building the cathedral because it's something that we can think about of everyone coming together to work on a particular task. And when you look historically at like the construction of these beautiful sacred spaces, there was a place for everyone sort of in the town, let's say, to add their part to the puzzle. And I think that also speaks again to this sort of like moving in the direction of integration through complexity, so that you have the difference, you have the individuation, but you also have it in service of the sort of bigger whole that is more than the sum of its parts, essentially, because people are coming together from different contexts and then creating this sort of whole from that. And so, yeah, I'd be encouraged to see, and it sounds like, I mean, there are many projects like this that are underway, where that's sort of, I think, kind of the driving mission to kind of balance these different forces in a kind of harmonious way.
Thank you. That was amazing. I'll use your reference to complexity as a segue to Seth, who speaks about complex problems and how design and coordination can help humanity, offer potential strategies and solutions for the complex problems that humanity faces. If you wouldn't mind just addressing that and maybe outlining what some of these complex problems are.
I think we're pointing to a lot of them. I really wanted to double down on Breedlove's suggestion, which is how we kind of detach, how we unplug from the matrix. I've been off social media and kind of the like news feed and landscape of scrolling for 5 years now, I think. And in that, I also started to get a lot more questions about how I was, especially during the pandemic, how I was able to kind of make sense of things and why I felt like stable in my decision making and confident. And I was like, because I'm just making sense of the community that's around me real time, right? And so the nature of coming together, you know, under a steeple, it's that we're sharing a behavior under there that can be kind of co-understood. I want to point to the harmony that Brendan just spoke to. That harmony, I think, is also correlated to what I would consider interdependence. The idea that the individual is a misnomer, and everyone, the word everyone, is a misnomer because the individual without everyone else wouldn't be a thing. We wouldn't think in the way that we think. This is Schmachtenberger can dive into this really deeply. It's a really profound kind of frame, which is that we are interdependent. And so how we make sense of the world in our interdependence is through meaning in these stories. And so we get what, like, I think one of our biggest areas for potential disaster is what we spoke to earlier, is culture wars. The culture wars are based in memetics. And it's basically like, who can build the best semi-aphorism that makes sense of the world to a degree that it is also catchy and then hooks. And that's where you get memetics. That's where you get virality. And that virality just like pours and pours and pours across a group of people. But the challenge is that you have to have structure to hold a memetic. So like virality on YouTube is YouTube holds the structure and Facebook holds the structure. A church holds the structure for a memetic to occur across a body of people. Catholic Church is just a giant commercial real estate development company, or like large development company is really what it is. They buy land, right? And then they subjugate groups of people that need the land to feel like they're inside of something. They subjugate them to specific memetics. Well, you drive the same hymn across a group of people time after time, they're going to get in a shared behavior. That's what people do. And so I think what's really unique is that we can still design this landscape of shared behaviors. It just doesn't have to have dogma attached to it. So when I think about, like, Roxy and Nico and I have focused a lot of time on the experiential economy. And the reason why is because it's actually that. It's an inbound economy coming at the world right now based in participatory moments that before we only had camps and maybe some types of education, but not much, and religion that we could co-participate in. Those were our ways of interfacing with the world. But like, Breedlove knows how to get people to do disaster relief and co-participate in that. And that's a behavior. And that behavior can be designed. And I really believe that this kind of inbound economy that is experiences is really just similar to how Hollywood made genres like documentaries and drama and horror and, you know, all these different places by which we make sense of the stories that we're learning through Hollywood, and they're in genres. Experience economy is just genred by behaviors, presence, connection, truth, sense making. You know, all of these things are explorations into behaviors that we do all together. And we just need to deploy spaces that like engineer the behavior for the specific space. And it's not saying your behavior has to be engineered when you're in here. We're saying we built this space to do this thing and it does it pretty well. And now we can deploy those spaces, right? The idea of Breedlove getting a container to a disaster relief area and the carbon footprint that it would make prior to now is very different, right? And so the patterning that can happen in relief structures that go out through coordinated effort and that entrain behavior, that's like, when you see a container full of tools that are like, it's really obvious what you should do. You're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. that all this stuff is here. And so I really think that like the deployment of space, the deployment of good location operations that hold specific behavior patterns in groups of people, that's important, because the reality is that in that interdependence, the individual is still going to be some kind of individual. There's a really beautiful quote by this artist, Aisha Badru. She's a singer-songwriter, and she writes a song called Water. She says, people are water. They need to be free. They need to explore where they want to be. We cannot be keepers of anyone's key. We have to love in a way that sets them free. We are sovereign decision makers where we can choose the communities that we want to participate in. We are not subject to those communities or the overarching behaviors of the communities. But when we do choose, my suggestion is choose and commit, because it's really the pulse and the repetition in the behavior that drives the like collective understanding. That's where really good collaboration comes from, is because you're repeating behaviors together. And so I think that's the opportunity. There doesn't need to be dogma. There doesn't need to be some religion of no religion. It's just like, we're just learning new behaviors together because more technology is here and we're not shutting it off, right? There's no switch on the wall that shuts off Moore's law. God bless it if there was, but there isn't.
Thank you. Thank you. I think one aspect of what you said that I'd like to pick up on, and sort of the last 15 minutes that we have, is that quote you gave from the singer-songwriter Aisha, and the word harmony that you mentioned and that Brendan was speaking about. Again, for me, this comes back to beauty. I think of the quote from Pythagoras: there is geometry in the humming of the strings, there is music in the spacing of the spheres. For me, the ultimate question is, what constitutes beauty? So if you understand that, you understand what constitutes a beautiful society and beautiful communities and beautiful spaces. And as I understand it, is a harmonious interrelationship between constituent parts. Right now, with that in mind, I'd like to open the floor to each of you, starting, maybe not you, Seth, because you've just spoken, but about 3 minutes each. We've spent so much time as a collective imagining dystopia. Like, how many dystopian films have you seen, right? How many times have you heard of what utopia looks like? How many times have we dared to really think, not protopia, which is where we're at, utopia, like in your wildest imagination, what could humanity as a species look like? Like no limits, no limits. That's where I want to go. That level of radical dreaming into being, what does it look like? That's my final sort of, for everyone to give about 3 minutes would be amazing. Anyone can start. I'll pick, seeing as you're not self-nominating. Roxy.
This is a great closing question. Thank you, Arabella, and thank you all. This has been fascinating, and I'm learning a lot, and also feeling very grateful to be a part of this conversation. So in my wildest imagination, what could humanity look like? And what does it look like? I think that it's interesting. Right before this, I was interviewed for Live from Earth, which is airing next week. And this was also the closing question to our conversation. So I'm definitely in this sort of imaginal space. I think that in my wildest imaginations, we are living in relationship with nature and in relationship with the seasons. We are both slowing down and embracing complexity. The previously systemically oppressed and marginalized voices are uplifted, the voices of the indigenous, the voices of the earth, the voices of women. There's in this future, I see that we have reimagined what our borders look like, and we have been able to contextualize as humanity the ways that our previous choices had different impacts on our planet. And so instead of being in this, the wealthy countries having impacts that they're disconnected from in developing countries, there's reparations both for colonized countries, for the land that's been extracted. And so we're living in this regenerated land. And by embodying the principles of regenerative leadership and being able to empower and work with technology as it's evolved, we've been able to free ourselves in some ways from centralized, siloed ways of being in a more decentralized, resilient, interdependent world. And as diversity breeds resilience, I think that is a huge part of that vision, is this empowerment of the unique potential of all life moving outside of a capitalist frame. I think Christopher spoke to this earlier. It's hard. There's also a quote that says something like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, or something like that. And I believe that in this future, we have been able to build new socioeconomic systems that incentivize social good and the well-being of all life, instead of just extraction and capitalism. Instead of putting the cult in culture, I think that in the future, we found ways to stand up to oppressive systems of power by modeling another way forward, instead of just bombing what's not right. And so restorative justice and environmental justice takes the front line. And I think that in this future, the unique gifts and the unique voice of all beings being able to live and thrive without having to cause harm to anyone else or anything else in order to get there is definitely a part of that future vision. And so I look forward to helping continue to co-create places and spaces that make this equitable, just, regenerative future, not only something we imagine, but something that we create and something that is possible for all future generations.
Thank you. Thank you. And it starts by believing it's possible. That if you don't believe it's possible, it's not going to happen. So it starts right here and right now with this conversation. Like, it's happening.
There's a quote or a statistic that I was recently reminded of, which is that it's something like 3%. It takes 3% of humans to rally together around something that they care about to actually create change. And so it really truly is like a small group of humans is all that it really takes, that really believe in something to make it possible.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Christopher.
Did you go to me? Great. I missed it there. It cut out. One of the things I like that Roxy said there about, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine a world without capitalism. Recently I also heard something that said, it feels impossible to imagine a world without capitalism, but so at once that it seemed to live in a world without the immutable right of kings. Oftentimes there are these massive changes in how we see that we can live on this planet. And I would say that, I feel like Roxy really encapsulated a lot of things, so I don't want to repeat any of those things, but I'll say that recently I've been, again, really influenced by the book, The Dawn of Everything, and really settling into the idea that, human history has actually been myriad. And we have self-organized in so many different ways that are both beautiful and probably terrible for the people who have been under those systems. And that the opportunity of the future is to continue to explore. I don't really know exactly what all of those things look like, but I do know that if I dream into the future that I want to be in, it's where we take more individual responsibility and sovereignty for our own lives. It's where we stop selling our rights and our freedom to larger systems, because those larger systems take care of the things that are uncomfortable for us to take care of. It's not putting things in the trash and imagining the trash goes somewhere else. It's not having someone else, take care of my waste system. What I've discovered through my Burning Man experience is that actually, when I'm the one out there working on my own microgrids, when I'm out there working on the system that takes away my own human shit, I don't always like it. But at the end of the day, it's more empowering, it's more connected, and I feel truly in charge of my own destiny. And I think that's the future that I want to dream into. In where is that world where we're all a little bit more in control of the systems that support us, but it also means we're more in control of the public spaces that we share, because that was the promise of a free world, is that we were in control. And I think what we've been losing is the actual sovereignty of it, because we've decided that other people taking responsibility for our lives is easier and more comfortable.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Brandon?
Yeah, so I guess for me, what's really important is that these sustainable that these utopian visions are sustainable, that they work, right? The downfall of utopian thinking in the past has been not giving enough credence to reality as it is, and thinking that all of reality was the hubris of thinking that all of reality was a blank slate that you could just totally remold and refashion as you want. And so I think that the sweet spot is where we work with existing constraints, but are able to reimagine reality within those constraints. One metamodern thinker, Hansi Freinock, talks about the difference between, sort of like living according to the game as it is and sort of affirming the game. Other people want to just deny the game, but what we really need is sort of a game change. We need to change the rules of the game, but that there's still going to be some rules of the game. And so I think that the most successful, directions that people have taken in the past to imagine better futures have always been sensitive to real life conditions, and because also history is littered with failed utopian visions that have been utterly awful. I mean, I'd love to see the world beyond capitalism as well, and then it's the challenge of how do we do that. If you just kind of take the approach that was taken in the early 20th century, you're going to have tens of millions of people dead, right? So it's sort of like, how do we do this in a way that works, that's sustainable, that's ethical, et cetera? And I think that there's always the ethical imperative for social visionaries and people who would reimagine society to really take that very seriously. But to give a very specific example, I mean, I imagine a realistic possible future of being something that is sustainable. I love the solar punk aesthetic. I think that there's something that we could find that is achievable where we are living close to the environment and yet don't have to just eschew technology entirely. I think that there's a possible hybridization and harmonization between our technological capacities and our ability to live close to the land and have those be sort of mutually kind of informing each other and not sort of in tension with one another. I think one of the biggest things that we need is education. We need contexts in which there is vibrant possibility for learning, for art, and for free time to explore and to learn and to grow. And to be real about what we could do in that vein. And so I envision people working in, communal sacred activities together, and having that deep connection, but also being able to balance again the individual and the communal, to not just throw off our individuality and sort of become sort of just give everything over to the collective, but to maintain our individuality or individuation and our difference, but also be able to toggle into the communal as well, balancing the local and the global. All these things, I see a future that's possible where we're able meaningfully to keep these seeming tensions together in a very successful way. And so I don't know, that'd be a quick pass at that question.
That was pretty brilliant. Thank you. Seth.
I'm trying to think about what each person said. And I feel like there's a golden thread here. I brought up aphorisms before because I do think they're powerful. One of my favorite aphorisms in the world, created by Forrest Landry, really special social philosopher, and he invited that love is that which enables choice, which really speaks to the end of what Breedlove was saying. We need to offer people the ability to choose and to be free. Our current economic systems don't do that. Our current social structures and religions don't do that. Civic systems don't do that. It's all kind of messy. But that's the new behavior that I think is so beautiful, is that when we're actually caring from that place, everything starts to actually feel a lot more alive. Everything starts to feel a lot more worth it, real. And I think that it points at, I think, I forget who was talking about the rules of the game. There kind of is rules of the game. I mean, physics would invite that you have two boundaries: causation and change. Causation, the emergent property, the like from nothing into something, and change, that it will constantly move. But there's this unique little slick layer right in between where those two things compound and they slam into each other. There's a slick layer that humanity has been invited into, which is choice. We have choice. We have choice to do amazing things. We have choice to take care. We have choice to love. We have choice to invite other people's sovereignty. And I think that that's a big part of what we have to remember. It's the thing that I grapple with every single day, is remembering that I both have choice and I'm in some kind of simulation. And it's real. Like, it's right in between there. And with that, I choose to not extend past people's time that they committed to us, because I'm very grateful for how much time was given for each of us to talk about our musings. This is really beautiful. So I'm very grateful, and thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. That was such a rich and fertile, fascinating discussion. I think just in terms of what everyone just said about utopia, the German idealist philosopher Hegel said the essence of the universe is freedom. He believed that the universe was moving towards ever greater iterations of freedom. You can get freedom like libertarianism in the USA, right? Or you can have a higher octave of freedom, which is, as you said, the freedom to choose to create love, to create beauty. That's all I have to say. I'd like to invite Nico to offer a closing comment to finish this panel. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
I would not dare to say one more word. That, like, I can't, guys. You crushed it. This was so good. I feel so humbled and honored to have all of you in my life and as friends, and to be co-creating stuff and doing the good work. Thank you, really. This has been profound, and I'm so glad we were here. I feel this was living history, and more of this, please. I'm so glad your brains got together. Thank you so much. And I hope all of you can continue enjoying the talks for today. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for your comments. And see you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.